Hello there. Welcome to the I Am Barabbas podcast. My name is Reggie Thile. If you are here for the first time, welcome you. If you are returning, I'm glad to know that you're back and that you're watching again, especially after last week. Having those sound issues was pretty frustrating. Figured out it was the camera was recording through itself and didn't couldn't see that in OBS. So there was a second track, and that's why the echo sound was there. So I know now that that's fixed, and I just hope that everything goes well and smoothly this time around. So we are in week 3 of our reading. If you are new to this program or to this podcast, I'll just briefly explain what we're doing. The Jewish community and culture and leadership, going back all the way to Ezra and the return from captivity in Babylon, established a pattern of public reading, a scheduled public reading that eventually morphed into this pattern that still exists today, right? What Ezra started wasn't exactly what we're doing now, but it is close to what is being done now. He was predominantly going through Deuteronomy in his public readings, and now what's being focused on throughout synagogues across the world, Jewish communities, is reading through the 5 books of Moses in a year, and having along with that a portion of from the prophets that kind of complements the Torah reading for the week. And what Messianic Jewish communities have started to do, and they've probably been doing them for a while or have done, is add some New Testament passages to those weekly readings, so that they too are studying the same portions of Scripture that the Jewish people are studying, but then they also get to have the extra commentary and light that comes through the knowledge of Yeshua being God's Messiah, and just how he fulfills stuff and everything and so forth. So it's a pretty cool kind of thing. And we just started this scheduled reading a couple weeks ago. And so as you can see on the screen, we're on week 3. It's called Lech Lecha, which in Hebrew means get yourself ready to go. Like it refers to the very first verse in chapter 12 of God calling Abram out of his father's household. And so you can see the passages there are Genesis chapter 12 through Genesis chapter 17, then Isaiah chapter 40 verse 27 through 41 verse 16, and then Romans chapter 4 verses 1 through 25. Now the last couple of times I've been doing this, I've been just kind of going in order, talking about each passage or chapter by chapter and sharing my thoughts. But this time I'm going to kind of integrate the Genesis passage with the Romans passage, and then look at the end at the Isaiah passage and just tie everything in that way. Right. So if again, as always, if you haven't had a chance to read the scripture, please go ahead and pause it now. Read those portions. I always recommend reading them at least 3 times and trying to do that in different translations. It helps our brains to kind of pick up on differences and nuances in language, or just something maybe we didn't see before. Writing down your own notes and thoughts about how you think these passages kind of tie together, and then go ahead and listen to the podcast and see what it is I had to say, and is this, and then we can investigate together if the Spirit's working. And as I've mentioned before, my goal is to eventually get this as a live broadcast where we're all kind of reading and studying and talking about it together. But until we kind of build up a base and have enough people following, I'm just going to go ahead and do it this way, where I post the videos on a week-to-week basis on Tuesday or Wednesday, and then let people have time to watch it before post the readings for the following week, which I'll post on Friday night, Lord willing, on my social media. All right, so let's get started. The first thing I want to do real kind of quick is look at some of the maps of the area, because now that we're getting into the story of the patriarchal period, and of course Noah is part of that, but Abram is kind of seen as the very beginning of the nation of Israel, right? God's first calling him out of his father's home, and so kind of helps to see, where on a map things are taking place, because the author understands that his reader is familiar with these locations, and where the places are. And in fact, when you read the scripture, you see evidence of the fact that the author understands that the reader knows where certain locations are. And even refer to the names of places from the past and saying like, such and such place that is, today called this, right? The example of that is the Jordanian plain that Lot goes to in, I think it's chapter 14. The writer says, which later becomes Sodom and Gomorrah and the site of destruction. So for the author's reader, they're also living in a different geographical context or time, but still they have a better understanding of these places. So I thought we'd just look at the maps real quick. So it's just kind of going back to the very beginning with Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. Where was that? And I know there's like a lot of opinions out there. That's cool about what that might be. The two most commonly agreed upon places, like in terms of scholarly and consensus and based on geography and the mention of the four rivers in Genesis chapter 2, are either up here in the mountains of Ararat, which would also coincide with the place where the ark would rest. And so I can click on the map that says flood subsides, and you see that kind of zoom right into the same area that Eden, the northern location for Eden might be. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom out. So it's kind of like close to each other. Or the second location would be down here south, and I can tell that's kind of small, but it's real close to the Persian Gulf. Okay, and that's pretty close to. It's real close to where Babylon is situated. And the first time we hear about Babylon in the land of Shinar is in Genesis chapter 10 in the genealogies and the mention of Nimrod, and then it's mentioned again in Genesis chapter 11, which was the last chapter of last week's reading. And so you see the establishment of the well-known famous Babylon, the nation that, or the place where people are going to end up coming to hold the people of Israel captive, or say the city of Jerusalem. And so it's a very important place to kind of understand like where it is. And you can see in terms of, and I'll just back out again, in terms of like where Israel is, we got Israel over here. If you can see my mouse just pointing to this area, Israel's land is here, and Sinai Peninsula, and then you have Egypt over here, and Babylon's over here. And so in between you've got this desert, right? And so you're not going to be able to kind of cross it. Now in modern days we've got Iran, and we've got Iraq, and we've got Israel. Now it's crazy that Iran like shot a bunch of missiles at Israel not too long ago. The fact that they like shoot them from here and over Iraq into there, it's kind of crazy that they can do that stuff. But yeah, that's the geography of this place and what's going on. Anyway, so when we zoom in here and we look at the time at the end of chapter 11, we can see where Ur is, and Ur was a really well-known city. The fact that it was Ur of the Chaldeans, that's more of an indication of the writer understanding that the reader knows who's now there. For all intents and purposes at the time, Chaldeans may be not necessarily in Ur at the time that Terah and Abram and everybody lived there, but it's named the Ur of Chaldeans, so that the reader is like, oh yeah, we know that where that is. And what's interesting is the Chaldeans are also known to be a Semitic people, meaning they're descendants from Shem, and they are also the ones who end up ruling over Babylon. And someone like Nebuchadnezzar comes from that line, from the Chaldeans. So it's really interesting. That's how I got into all this, because like, where is Abram coming from? Why is it the place of Chaldeans? Is he a Chaldean Semite? Yes, they're all from the line of Shem, and that's where we're focusing on, right? We're focusing on, I should say the author is focusing on this line of people that come from Shem, who is, I believe, the oldest son of Noah, and believed to be the only one to really be associated with walking after the God of Noah. Right? Ham and Japheth kind of going different ways. So what we have here is we have Ur way down here. We saw the map earlier of where Babylon is. I can kind of do that. You can see Babylon is just east of this like body of water here. So if I go back to Terah settles in Haran. So Terah walks from Ur. Again, that could be where one of the locations of Eden was. And he heads northwest about that, and he ends up in a city called Haran. Apparently coincidentally named after his son who died young. But left behind a son named Lot, so Terah's grandson Lot, Abram's nephew. And then in the beginning of chapter 12, where this week's reading starts, is where God speaks and calls out to Abram And Abram leaves Haran to go to Canaan. Now, one thing that I noticed was interesting at the end of chapter 11, it says that Terah was going to Canaan, but then he stopped in Haran. And it made me wonder, like, did God first call Terah to go to Canaan? And Terah, when he reached Haran, was kind of like, yeah, this is where I want to stay. I don't know, but it's just something I thought of, right? So anyway, so Abram continues his journey. It tells us he was, I believe, 75 years old at the time that he leaves his father's home, and he takes with him Lot and everything he has, and he travels down into the land of Canaan, and there he settles in Shechem first, where he creates an altar to the Lord, and then he goes to a place between Bethel and Ai, which I believe is related to the place known as Shiloh, which later becomes the home of the temple, or sorry, the tabernacle. So if I go into the Biblical World Conquest map and we get in a little closer, we should see Shiloh. So I saw it real quick. It kind of faded. It's kind of sometimes hard because of just connecting OBS. But I think it is in that area, and I'm trying to get closer. And there's just like tons of cities coming in. If you're watching this now, you see I'm just like, oh, where did this place go? Oh, so here's Shiloh. Here's Shechem. The idea is that he stops in a place between Ai and Bethel. So it's not Shiloh. Shiloh's up here. And why am I mentioning Shiloh? Because Shiloh believes the first place that the ark ends up resting when Joshua comes into the land. He comes into Jericho, and then you have the battle with Ai. But what Genesis chapter 12 tells us is a place between Bethel and Ai is where Abram sets up an altar as well. So with all that said and shown, I think that kind of ends what I wanted to do with as far as like the location. Later on in our story, we see that Abram, he travels down into Egypt. And so I'm going to leave that map there because we're going to get to that part of the story pretty soon. And what I wanted to really focus on to start with, and there's so much here, right? Chapter 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, there's just so much in the story that we could talk about, that I could just go over and really spend like hours on. But don't want to do that because I don't want to, make this so long that people are too bored to finish it or whatever. Just notice the similarities in the passages and the stories as we move on from like the story of Adam, then the story of Cain, and then the story of Noah, and then the story now of Abram. And when I talk about the reason why I mentioned those four people is because it's very specific as to who the scripture, the writer is very specific as to who God speaks to and what they speak about. Or what he speaks about, I should say. And I've said in the past, I think it's God speaks about light, about how to bring light into the world. God warns about darkness and about how darkness will enter the world, and he will even have to deal with sin and the curses related to sin, and that as a result brings darkness through actions of people. When he speaks to Cain, he warns Cain about a path towards darkness that he might take, that he may or may not take. He speaks to then Noah, and he tells Noah, here's a way of light out of the darkness that you're in. Remember, the whole world was just kind of back into this welter and waste kind of state like it was in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, before God said, let there be light. And so he's looking at Noah, and he's like, hey, I want you to build this ark. And so Noah is obedient to that call, and he makes that ark. And so he shows a way of light, salvation, path out of the darkness. And here he calls Abram and out of his father's home, and what he's doing here is a little different now than what he's done in the past. He's still speaking about light and a path out of maybe the darkness that the world last went into. If you remember, after the flood, God said, I know that humans are going to do this kind of thing again. So I want to make a promise that I'm not going to go with the flood again and punish everybody. I'm going to approach this differently. And so by calling Abram, he really is taking a different approach this time. Now he is looking for the person that he believes fits the model or the requirements for righteousness and blamelessness at the beginning, or closer to the beginning, rather than waiting to the end, right? With Noah, is like, oh, this is the last guy. So instead of going with the last guy, it's like, let's look at one of the people now, and let me build a nation out of him, to create a whole nation of people that can claim to have an ancestry from, or to be descendants from, or an ancestor like Abraham, to be his children, to have his faith and his righteousness, so that the approach to the world and to human beings in their heart can be different. So this is the path of light. So he calls Abram out, and he tells him, I'll make a great nation, right? That's exactly what, everything I just said. I'll bless you, and I'll bless those who bless you. And so Abram, just like Noah, he obeys. It says in verse 4, Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. And he takes his wife with him, everything he's got, and they go to Canaan. They go to Shechem, like we said, and the Canaanite was in the land. So this isn't a place that's like free and clear. There's there's other people there, and presumably they're not going to be friendly people, especially if you start talking about, oh, God's given me this land. Not usually accepted or well by the people who already are on the land, right? And so he gets to Shechem. It tells us that the Canaanites were there, so we know that he has to contend with these people. And then it says that the Lord appears to Abram there, and he again promises him the land. Abram responds with building an altar, and then in verse 8 he pulls up his stakes. Or why doesn't he stay there? The concept of pulling up the stakes and traveling and sojourning, it's indicative of the kind of people Abram comes from. They're nomadic people. And a lot of the people from this time were nomadic, and nomadic meaning you're just always kind of on the move. You've got cattle, you've got herds. They have to feed on grass. You can't stay in one place too long, because if you do, they run out of food. So you have to go to the next place, to make sure that all the animals are taken care of. And so he pulls up his stakes, and he goes on to, this is the high country east of Bethel and west of Ai. And so we just, we saw that little thing on the map. And there he builds an altar. And notice the difference here. The first time with Shechem, God appears to him. Not just that time, it's also before, when he was in Haran, God appeared to him and spoke to him. With Noah, God spoke to him. Noah does build an altar to God after the flood, and then God smells the smell of the sacrifices, and that's what kind of initiates the idea, like, I'm not going to flood the earth again. But every other time God is speaking, and then if an altar is built, that's where Abram does it. It's because God appeared to him. But in verse 8, this altar that's between Bethel and Ai is the first time that we see someone build an altar and then invoke the name of the Lord, meaning they call and they summon out God's presence, right? So it's not that God appeared in this place, or even with Noah, he didn't call out or anything. He just lit up the sacrifice and started going, and then God smelled it. For Abram, he's going into this place, he's building an altar, and he's calling and summoning God to hear him, to hear his sacrifices or whatever. We don't know exactly what he asked, but that's what he does. And that's the first place he invokes, or he calls upon the name of the Lord. And that's going to come up again later. Then it says that he goes by stages on to the Negev, and he goes down into Egypt. Now, here's where I kind of want to depart a little bit from the story, and just kind of, and you can see on the map here what that journey was like. And again, it's by stages. By stages, the author is saying, step by step, as a nomad would, pulling up stakes, letting these animals feed, then going to the next place. So it's a time and a process in which is going on. In the next verse in chapter 10, it tells us that there was a famine, and then he had to go down to Egypt. And I want to point out for you, as a reader, if you didn't notice this, you can read it again, look at it. The entire account now is very similar to what we're going to read in a few weeks from now at the middle part of Genesis, the end part of Genesis, with the story of Jacob and his sons and Joseph. Now, Joseph is taken as a slave, sold by his brothers into Egypt, right? Ends up in Egypt. But then Jacob and the rest of his sons end up in Egypt for the same reason. There's famine in the land, and they have to go down into Egypt. And later on, I believe it's in chapter 17, God tells Abram, hey, listen, your people that are going to come from you and from Isaac, we finally, get to know his name and that it's going to happen. They're going to go through what you went through. They're going to go down into Egypt. They're going to have trouble there, and then they're going to be let out, but after a certain amount of time, and then they're going to return here. And in this story, we see how that happened, how that plays out for Abram. He goes down into Egypt, and because of famine, and he anticipates trouble, right? Some people, a lot of people, maybe everybody, maybe this is the truth. I kind of lead a different way with this conversation, but they read into it that Abram was afraid, and because of his fear, he gives the instructions to Sarah to lie, or Sarai, and to say, they will kill me while you live. Say, please, that you're my sister. Kind of like he's begging out of fear. I think based on the other two conversations he has, and this is the first time Abram's speaking, that it's possible that this isn't done out of fear, but it's done out of his own wisdom. And I think in the next two conversations he has, where it's told to us that he's speaking, you can see that he has a very wise way. He's calm, he's polite, he's discerning. He knows how to speak to people in a way where he kind of gets what he wants, and at the same time protects himself and even protects the interest of others. He's not just looking out for me, myself, and me, right? He's looking out for everybody in the situation. Now, he doesn't necessarily look out for Pharaoh in this situation, but he does do this in a wise way, because in what I think, again, is wisdom. It could be out of fear, right? I'm not arguing that. He tells Sarah to say that he's a sister, she's his sister, and then the Egyptians see that she's beautiful, and they take her, which proves what he was thinking, that if they see this woman, they're going to see that she's beautiful, and they would kill me. But instead, because his sister, they don't kill him. They just go ahead and take her. And then it says that the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his household with terrible plagues. And again, I think all of this is foreshadowing. So I think the reader at the time is most likely a person of Israel who has gone out of Egypt. Remember, a lot of people believe in the authorship of these stories by Moses, maybe later edited by somebody or some people to kind of, fit together a narrative in a story, in a scroll. And it's just kind of natural that would happen. But if Moses is like originally writing these things down as an account for the people, it makes sense that he would think about his people and what they've gone through, and make sure that he talks about these parts of Abram's history, so that when they read it, they look at what their father Abram has gone through, and they can say, "Wow, we went through the same thing." And that relatability and connectedness with the past is really powerful for the present, especially if the present is hard and is difficult to go through. And if right now if the reader is in the wilderness and they're wandering for 40 years, waiting for the time where they can enter the promised land, they can read this and say, wow, our father went through the same thing. Father Abraham went through the same thing, and we really are his children, right? So I think that's kind of the theme of what's going on here. Notice at the end of verse 19, when Pharaoh is confronting Abram about not telling him the truth about who Sarai was, he says, take her and get out. And it's very similar to Moses, or the Pharaoh telling Moses, just get them, just take your people and go. And it's really the opposite. It's similar language in Hebrew, but it's the opposite tone of what you hear at the beginning of the passage, where God is very gently like calling Abram and says, hey, listen, you need to get up and go from here and go to the land that I'm calling you to go to, versus, hey, get up and get out of here. I don't want to see you anymore. And so with that, Abram leaves. And that's the end of chapter 12. And I think, again, it speaks to this experience that the people of Israel go through. And you can see that he comes up from Egypt, together with them from the Negev. And now, just like the Israelites did, he's heavy laden. That means with cattle, silver, and gold. So it seems like Pharaoh's like, get out of here, take the gold, take wealth. It says that he also took male and female servants back in chapter 12. And so now, by going down there and then having this experience, he went there poor. looking for food. Famine was striking the land, didn't have anything. Now he's coming out rich. And again, that's very, that's foreshadowing exactly how Israel leaves Egypt after their time of enslavement. You see where he goes first is back to the place where it was where he invoked the name of the Lord. That was that spot between Bethel and Ai where he had built an altar for the first time. And from there, the story kind of diverges into a different spot. But it's also similar to the story of Israel. They know that they're not all going to be able to dwell together. They need to be able to spread out and take the land and be able to, take different parts of it so that everybody can survive on their own. And so Lot and Abram are kind of a picture of that. At this point, they have too much stuff together. There's strife going on between Lot's workmen and Abram's workmen or their herdsmen. And again, Abram, and this is where I think the evidence comes into play, where his way of speaking is wise. It's calm. It's polite. He says to Lot, like, pray. There's no contention between you and my herdsmen. Not the land before you. Pray, and he gives Lot the choice. Now, I don't know if he knew Lot would look off to the east and see the plain of Jordan and want the well-watered land. And again, that's what I was referring to earlier, the part where it says before the Lord's destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So the people who are reading the story are familiar with that part of the story, which doesn't come until Genesis, I think 18 or 19. So they, that again, pointing to a fact that the writer is writing at a time where people are aware of a different context and time. They're past it in sense of when, Abram's story is taking place. Even for them, it's in the past. But anyway, so going back, so Lot sees the good part, what he thinks is good, and he chooses it. And what's interesting here is that I haven't really mentioned it. There is a rabbinical thought and idea that overall these early stories tell us about the importance of staying away from dwelling in cities and buildings and that kind of like an urban environment. Okay, the evidence for that goes back to Cain and how Cain was cursed. Another way where he had to like build on top of the ground instead of being able to till through it. Right, tilling through it was difficult already. Cain was cursed again and had to build on top of it. And so he builds bricks and cities and so on and so forth. And then when you have you move forward and you have Nimrod, so you go, let's go ahead and build this together with bricks. And then it was a bad thing. So God comes and sees it. And he sends everyone away. And Lot choosing a city to live in over staying in this more of a wilderness type area, or not wilderness, but just more of this nomadic lifestyle, is indicative of a wrong choice, or it's a wrong choice for the rabbis. And I believe that the writer is also trying to explain that to his reader as well. And how you know that is in verse 13, immediately he picks Sodom and he goes over there, over by the city. And it tells us that the people of the city were very evil offenders against the Lord. Okay. So Lot has chosen poorly. And that's what chapter 14 really highlights for us, is the idea that Lot, you made the wrong choice because you went to go live in the city. Everybody there is evil. And then you become the pawn of this war between kings where they kidnap you, put you in danger, and now your uncle has to come and save you. And that's kind of like, and then the crescendo or the big climax is the ultimate total destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's like, Lot, you should have never chosen this place. You're the only one who's righteous to come out of it. You really shouldn't have picked this place. Do you see now? And so for the reader too, okay, are we going to settle in the cities that are here, like Jericho, Ai, as we enter into the promised land? Is that what we're going to do? We're going to build up cities. And there's just like a kind of a general thought against that kind of lifestyle, right? And the reason why it's not clear for it goes back to Cain and the curse of Cain and the idea of Eden and how God originally wanted humans to live, and that's taking care of the earth and growing from the earth and in paradise, plants and fruits and vegetables and everything else, and living in a way that's kind of dependent on the earth and God's provision through it. Instead of building up cities for yourself, when you build up a city, you then have to that city has to be able to sustain itself more or else it's going to collapse and fall, right? A city has to be able to have water and sewer and everything, and food and groceries and everything else. Otherwise, there can be trouble down the line. So I'm going to go ahead and skip to chapter 14. Not before I mention, so verse 17, this rise, in case anybody was wondering, that's a ritual related to claiming land as your own. You'd walk around that length, breadth of the land. That was a what's it called? A ritual that goes back to a very long time ago. In fact, documents from the time of Abram, the Ugaritic text from the 12th to 14th century, show that those people too also did the same kind of thing to claim land. And so all of that, that's just what that means. If you're wondering, why is he walking around the land? That was just a ritualistic action done to claim, like, this land is mine. So if Canaanites saw him do that, what they saw him doing was saying, this land is now mine. And then after that, he takes up his tent again, and he goes to dwell by the terebinths of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and he built there an altar to the Lord. So again, in chapter 14, Lot is taken captive by these kings who go to war. A fugitive from Lot's group goes and tells Abram. Abram gets up 300 something men, and they go and they rescue him. And as they are returning, we learn about a very interesting character named Melchizedek, king of Salem. His name means the righteous king, and so Melchizedek, with the root word being Zadaka, which is the word for righteousness. So he's the righteous king of Salem, which comes from the Hebrew word for shalom, which is peace. So he's the righteous king of peace. And you notice he brings out bread and wine, and he turns out that he's a priest to El Elyon, or the Most High God. Okay, and he blesses Abram. And Abram gives him a tithe of everything he recovered from pursuing Lot, because he went and pursued Lot and the people who took him, and he's bringing back a bunch more stuff, and so he gives a tithe of what he has to this priest, and then the king of Sodom wants something as well, right? The king of Sodom's like, hey, your nephew lives with me, whatever. You went and you rescued him and all that. It's good. But there should be a little something that comes to me, because these were my people that were stolen. And notice Abram's response is, I raise my hand to the Lord that I will not take a single thread or sandal strap that is yours. So lest I say I've made Abram rich. And again, I think this points out to Abram's wisdom. It's just like a different level. I think he's smart in the way he deals with people. And so he knows how to say things in a way where this king doesn't get offended. He gets to have what he wants, and at the same time, he also has to know what it means for Abram to not give him, or to not take what the king of Sodom wants to give him as well, right? Because he wants to make sure that his reputation remains as someone who's blessed by God, not by any human. By the way, with Melchizedek, I know there's a lot there. If you read Hebrews chapter 5, 6 and 7, you'll get a really cool perspective on Melchizedek and the function of Jesus, Yeshua, as high priest. The writer of Hebrews says that he is of that line, where we don't know where he begins, we don't know where he ends. Speaking of Melchizedek, Yeshua is the same way. It just seems like he always was and always will be kind of idea. And so the writer of Hebrews takes liberty to make that analogy between Melchizedek and Yeshua. And he even claims that because Abram tithed to Melchizedek, the line of priesthood that Melchizedek represents, which only Yeshua is a continuation of, is greater than Aaron's line, because Abram, being the progenitor, the father of all the Israelites, including Levi, in a way, the Levites and Aaron also tithe to Melchizedek, even if they were in the loins of Abram. So that's just kind of Hebrews chapter 5 through 7. If it doesn't make sense to you, sorry, but it's just kind of the argument that the author of Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews, makes, and that comes from chapter 14. All right, so I see we're at 34 minutes here. I think we're going great and a good pace. We're about to start to get into the Romans passage as well. Now, if you remember, God is promising Abram throughout all this, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to give you the land. I'm going to give you the land. You're going to make you a nation of many people. and Abram's believing, and Abram's going, and he's following, and he's doing. And in the beginning of chapter 1, it says, the word of the Lord came to Abram, which is an interesting phrase, kind of like the kind of phrase that you would normally hear with a prophet coming. Like if a prophet spoke on the behalf of God, like God spoke to the prophet and a prophet came. It doesn't tell us that, but it's kind of like that kind of modality. And the reason why is because it comes in a vision. And vision and dreams are really important. The book of Numbers explains how that works, but it comes in a vision. So Abram has a vision, and God promises him again that he is going to, bless him. And this is the first time we see Abram maybe, doubt, or he's trying to come up with a different plan. And his plan is, look, I have this guy, Damesk, and Eleazar, can he be my heir? Because they don't have any heirs yet. And it says the word Lord came to him saying, no, that's not him, but it's going to be someone that comes from your body, right? And he promises again. And then verse 6, it says, and he trusted in the Lord and he reckoned it to his merit. And remember, this is some years now. Some years have gone on since he first left Haran. He's been obedient. We know that he has Ishmael at the age of 86. He left Haran when he was 75. So 11 years later is in chapter 16 when he tries to make things happen on his own. It's Sarai has his plan to make things on her own. But and then it's 13 years after that when Isaac is finally born. But even so, it says here in verse 6 that he trusts the Lord and that God reckons it to his merit. Now, what does that mean, right? It's obviously a very interesting phrase to have here. What Robert Alter talks about is how the covenant works and the idea that there's a divine insurance. And it says the second scene evokes mystery, magic, and the troubling enigma of the future. Meaning, in the first scene, progeny is promised, a child is promised, descendants are promised. And second, the possession of the land, together with dark prospect of enslavement in Egypt. So he's talking about what happens next is also going to happen. But ultimately, the phrase he reckoned to his merit was just a really interesting one, and it really stood out to the person of Paul as he wrote in Romans chapter 4. Now, this is kind of like the meat of what I want to kind of get across today for this podcast and this message or this study. And I think this is what God wants all of us to understand. It definitely made an impact on me as I was studying over the weekend and thinking about how to teach and what to teach about. So in Romans chapter 4, Paul is writing about, following the law and righteousness, following the law and righteousness, and the belief that a lot of people had that if you follow the law and you follow the rules of the law, then you will obtain righteousness, right? And Jesus also had to deal with this with the Pharisees. They thought the same way. And so he's kind of explaining that common idea as it circulates through Judaism of the time that you do and then you gain righteousness, like you've earned it as wages. But he said, but that's not how it worked for our father Abraham, and we are his children. So as his children, we need to see how he obtained righteousness and understand it's the same way for us. We're not different than he is. He is pretty special. It says, if Abraham was set right by works, he has something to boast about. So he says, if it said that his righteousness was merited to him or credited to him based on the things that he did, then Abraham could boast in the fact that he was good at doing the right thing. But Paul says that's not how it worked. And that's not what happened. In verse 3 of chapter 4, Paul says, and I'm just peeking to see if it's on screen. Yeah. So it says, but what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. This is now to the one who works, pay is not credited as a gift, but as what is due, right? If you work, you get wages because you've worked and it's owed to you. And so what he's saying is if we had to earn righteousness by works, then we're just getting what we're owed, right? We're not being given a credit for anything in the future. We're just being given what is due to us. But what Abraham received was a credit for righteousness. And we're going to look at what that means in a second. It says, but to the one who does not work, but trusts in him who justifies the ungodly, his trust is credited as righteousness. that's going back to the example of Abraham. And he says, just as David also speaks of this blessing on the man whom God credits righteousness apart from works. And this is what it means to be credited righteousness through faith, not by works. Be credited righteousness. It means, blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven and whose sin are covered. Blessed is the man whose sin Adonai will never count against him. In other words, what Paul is trying to explain here, and what even Moses is trying to explain, whoever the writer is, right? There's higher criticism if people talk about different writers, whatever. But whoever the writer was of Genesis, and what he was trying, or he or she was communicating to the reader, is this: Abraham received righteousness as a credit because of his faith. His faith to God meant, I am going to cover this person in my grace. Future sin, lawless deeds are forgiven. That's what it means to be credited righteousness. So you have this big bank. So if it worked this way, I do something bad, I have to do something righteous to undo what was bad, so I pay off that debt to God. Right? If that's the way it worked, you do good things to pay off what was the bad things that you've done. What faith is a credit of righteousness in which you can withdraw, and you say you've messed up, you've sinned, and you can take from that credit that you've been given of righteousness and apply it to those sins, and you can be forgiven. That's what Paul's trying to help the reader of Romans understand, and that's what is being understood about Abraham. Okay, and he goes on in chapter 17. He talks about the circumcision. Now, in our passage back in Genesis, we look at chapter 17, and I know there's a lot of stuff there. If we have some time later, I'll kind of go back to it. But in chapter 17 and chapter 16 is the story of Hagar and Ishmael. But in chapter 17, we learn about God's final, or I guess not final, but it's like the final time he's kind of speaking to Abraham about his promise. This is where he renames them, tells him he's going to be a father of nations, going to make him abundant, fruitful, establish my covenant, all that stuff we've already been seeing, Abraham's been hearing. And he says, he finally gives him a commandment besides the commandment to leave, right, his father's house. He gives him a new commandment. And he says, you shall keep your commandment. This is the commandment I want you to keep, and that's the commandment of circumcision. I want you to get circumcised. I want the baby who's at 8 days old to be circumcised. That's the youngest. And then everybody else who's there has to be circumcised, including you, who's now, I think, like 99 years old. And what's interesting is at this time, Alter spoke to this, and other historians as well. It wasn't an unusual thing, actually, for people to be circumcised at later ages. What was new was the idea that from now on, an 8 days old male had to be circumcised. So that was new. And so it was going to be a new kind of practice amongst human beings that was going to indicate to everybody that these people had a commandment that they're following through on. And that commandment is a fulfillment, or it points to this covenant that God has made with Abraham. Okay. And so naturally, do then people have to be circumcised to have the covenant applied to them, right? The argument that Paul makes in verse 9 of Romans chapter 4, he says, is this blessing then only on the circumcised, or also on the uncircumcised, right? He's like, you have this blessing. What's the blessing? The blessing of being credited righteousness. That's a huge blessing. But does it only apply to the circumcised, or also the uncircumcised? And he says, for we trusted, so we say trust was credited to Abraham. And then he just makes a really logical argument in verse 10 and 11. He's like, hey, but understand this, when Abraham received the credit of righteousness, he himself was uncircumcised. The circumcision came later. It was something that God said, okay, now I want you to do this as a sign of the covenant between the two of us. So God saw Abraham's faith, counted that as righteousness, a credit of righteousness, where he's going to forgive his sins. And then he starts to give directives to Abraham in terms of what he expects Abraham to do. And Abraham believes, and Abraham obeys because he believes and he listens to God and he obeys, right? And what is really being said here by Paul and by James as well is that all of these things work together. It starts with faith. It starts with faith. It's never earned, right? So you don't do the things first and then receive the righteousness and then have the faith. That's what Paul's trying to help people understand in this new era after this death and resurrection of Yeshua the Messiah. He's like, you don't first do and then you get the promise and then you have faith and then from there you grow. No, it's you have the faith first and then you're covered. Believe that. And then from there, you're going to receive commands and you're going to obey those commands out of the faith that you originally had, that originally granted you your righteousness. Right? And if you're like, well, what are the commands? Jesus was so clear about this. This commandment I give to you, that you will love one another. Right? By this, the world will know that you are my disciples, that you love one another. That's why John wrote that when he was asked what are the two most important laws. He says that you would love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you would love your neighbor as yourself. Okay. The Sermon on the Mount teaches some more stuff. Don't commit adultery. Understand that adultery is considered this when you look at a woman, and it's not just the act. Don't commit murder, and understand murder is not just actually killing someone. It's the rage that comes there. So Jesus, you have to read the Gospels, see what Jesus talks about. But again, you're not earning your righteousness in obeying. What you're doing is you're relying on the fact that your faith is your credit for righteousness. And from there, in faith and obedience, you see the commands of God and you follow. Okay? And that's what he is trying to say here in Romans chapter 4 in verse 12. He says, also walking in the footsteps of the trust of our father Abraham before his circumcision. He says, remember, Abraham went and he went and he went and he listened and he went and he did all the things that God wanted him to do. And then ultimately, the last kind of step was the circumcision. I believe right after that is when Isaac is conceived. And so that's how he closes out chapter 4. He says, for this reason, it depends on trust. The promise according to grace might be, so that the promise according to grace might be guaranteed to all the offspring, not only to those of the Torah, but also to those of the faith of Abraham. Okay, so not just those who know the law and they're following the law, but to those who have the same faith and start from the same place that Abraham did. And look at this concept here. He says, what was a big aspect of Abraham's faith? This goes back to the reading in chapter 17. He says, he is our father in sight of God, in whom he trusted, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence that which does not exist. Remember back in chapter 17 of the reading, he says to God, he's like, how is it that you're going to bring life from like this dead body? Right? That's the way he sees himself. He sees Sarah, and he sees that that they are dead. That's what this verse 17 says. To a 100-year-old will a child be born? Will a 90-year-old Sarah give birth? And it says that he laughed to himself. So as he says that, he's like, is this really going to happen this way? And then he asks that Ishmael instead of doing it this way, can we have Ishmael? So there is, he's still like trying to negotiate. Again, I think speaking to his wisdom and seeing what he can do and get out of his relationship with God. But ultimately, Paul says that was a sign of his faith. The idea that he thought, you know what, God can bring life out of what's dead. And so he continued to walk in that way. It says in verse 18, and hope beyond hope, he trusted that he would become the father of many nations according to what is spoken. And without becoming weak in faith, he considered his own body as good as dead, since he was already 100 years old in the deadness of Sarah's womb. So just what I was saying before, Paul explains, and then he didn't waver in his belief. Rather, he was strengthened in faith, giving glory to God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, right? His faith is what created that credit. Now, here's where the application comes to us. As me, I'm a Gentile, and for anybody really who is looking at Yeshua and looking at Abraham and seeing faith, and how does this all work then? Now, and what he says in verse 23 says, now not only for his sake was it written that it was credited to him, but for our sake as well. It is credited to us as those who trust in him who raised Yeshua, our Lord, from the dead. So for Abraham, his trust was believing in what God was telling him and promising him. We saw that in chapter 15, verse 6 of Genesis. God is again telling him the promise, the covenant, the land, the seed, everything shall be yours. And it says that he trusted in the Lord, and that was given to him as his credit for righteousness. That faith was rewarded that way. For us now, for us who believe that God raised Yeshua from the dead, that is where our faith begins, and that's where our credit is given to us in believing that. And why was he raised from the dead? Why did he die? Was because he was handed over for our transgressions and raised up for the sake of setting us right. So the reason for believing that God raised Yeshua from the dead is that he was dead because he died for our transgressions, not for his own, and that he was raised to show the power of God and to put us in the right position. So in having that belief, that's where we are credited the righteousness. And that's why Romans chapter 4 is given as a corresponding passage with the book of Genesis, the reading for this week. I've come up on we've got about 10 minutes till we reach an hour, and I want to look at Genesis and just see if there's anything else I needed to cover. I don't think so. I think the thing that stuck out to me with Hagar's story and Abram and Sarah and Sarai, and this is like the only time she ever speaks to, or at least in these passages, and she comes up with another plan, and there's a couple times where Abram comes up with an alternative, like, oh, could this servant be my guy? God said no. Later he says, oh, could Ishmael just be the guy, my descendant? God said no. And in between that, it was Sarai who said, oh, maybe you can have a kid, because God said it's going to be from your loins, but maybe not necessarily from my body, from me. So be with my servant Hagar, who she was one of the servants or slaves they got from Egypt. And so he took her on as a wife, a concubine, or a second wife, however you want to say it. And that's how Ishmael was born. And in that story, there's abuse by Sarai. She sees that Hagar sees her as not as important as she used to be, because now she's got the baby and Sarai doesn't. And so it says Sarai harassed her, abused Hagar, and sent her out. And in that whole thing, a messenger is sent to Hagar. And that's the first time we see in the scripture that a messenger is sent. Normally it's God himself who's speaking to people. He speaks to, the Adam and Eve. He speaks to Cain. He speaks to Noah. He speaks to Abram. When it comes to Hagar, he sends a messenger. And it's the first time we're seeing that. And I thought that was interesting. And the messenger speaks on the behalf of God. And and as a result of that whole conversation, Hagar's response is to name the God that she's now getting to know as the God who sees her. And she names the place as the place of being seen, the place of being seen. I'm kind of paraphrasing, but that's the idea. And I think it's pretty powerful to think about the idea that the fact that, with Jesus and with our need for salvation and light from God, that God sees us. He sees us, right? That's what light allows us to do. I struggle with darkness. I'm always having to use a flashlight or something to see behind certain things. My wife has her eyes, she can see better in darker areas, and then when there's a lot of light, it's more sensitive, whatever. But I've always appreciated the presence of more light to be able to see better of what's around me, and so on and so forth. And I think Hagar's testimony and her naming God as the one who sees her was also something that was really powerful for me, because I'm thinking about so many years in the future. And in Genesis chapter 12, God says, you're going to be the father of many nations, right? And I can't help but read that and think about myself. And it's not just me. I've heard that said before. And so I think it's this kind of idea that's kind of grown in my mind, and to say, man, God saw me too, right? He sent his messenger to Hagar to tell her, hey, look, you're not going to be dying here in the desert, your son crying and dehydrating and all that kind of stuff and dying of thirst or starvation. I see you. You can go back and I will take care of you and I will grow this son of yours into a great nation. And I think and he sent his messenger to do that. And I think it's so cool to have the idea that God saw me, he saw you way back then when this is all written. All these things were actually happening. And he saw Reggie and he saw, whoever else might be listening. And he saw the person or the thing that you kind of had to go through to be able to get to the place where you too could say, God sees me. God has seen me. And then to the point where you can hear about Yeshua and hear about his death and his resurrection and how you could believe and then have that credit to you as righteousness. I think that's another takeaway that I had there. And just to wrap up with the last few minutes, I don't want to ignore our Haftarah or the prophetic passage. Again, the Genesis passages and the Isaiah passage is what's read in synagogues or was read this past Sabbath. And then they may have Bible studies or whatever throughout this week about it. They talk about it, and then they'll have a new passage this coming Sabbath. And so I'm thinking about those people as well and what Isaiah helps them to see in terms of what Genesis had to tell them and what the Isaiah passage is about, just like we looked at Romans. And what Isaiah does is, or what the Isaiah passage does, I should say, to complement the Genesis passage, is to remind the people and the people of Israel that God is the same God that created the earth. He's the same eternal God. He's a God that doesn't grow weary. He's a God that doesn't grow tired. In fact, he's the one that gives strength to the weary. And if you remember, Isaiah 40 is believed to be written to those who were in Jerusalem leading up to the first captivity. Okay, so think about the context of that. Maybe they're besieged by Nebuchadnezzar. It's hard to really pinpoint it, but ultimately they are very much feeling like they've lost the promises of God because of their sin or because of whatever happened in their past. And Isaiah 40 ends with promises about how God will renew their strength. And then you get into Isaiah chapter 41. And again, it calls out to the people and says, let them renew their strength. Who has stirred up one from the east? He calls feet to justice. He gives nations to him. So what it's referring to is the idea that now, as the captivity began and started and they've been captive for so many years, it's God who then brings up somebody from the east. And that was I think the Persians came from a different direction, but the idea, relative to where they are in Israel. So from the east, they're coming back. And he's calling forth the generations and they're coming home and everybody's encouraging each other and saying everything's good. Why? Because they were called out to the uttermost parts of the earth. In verse 9, it says, I took hold of you from the ends of the earth. So he's saying, you were all scattered about, but you are my servant, and I have chosen you, and I have not rejected you. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Surely I will help you. I will uphold you. Look at all those who are angry. They will be ashamed and disgraced. Nothing, though you will look for those who contend with you, and I'll find them. And just the language again, fear not, you worm, Jacob. So they're feeling, this is like the place that they're feeling in. They're finding themselves in. And it reminds me of Hagar too. God through this prophet is declaring to the people, I still see you and I am going to bring you back. I am your redeemer in verse 14. And I'm going to make you so powerful. You're going to scatter the mountains. You're going to destroy the hills, and the mountains will be ground up. And you will be the one that's left, right? And you will rejoice in my glory. And I think that's where, the people of Israel and the Jewish people, as they look at even their situation now, and they look at Israel and the conflict that they have, and they think back, they read through Genesis chapter 12 and 13 and 14 and to 17, and they see the promises to Abram, and they see that those promises are real, and they believe in those promises just like you or I would as believers in Yeshua. And then they have this part of their history, and then they have where they are now, and they can kind of relate. We're not safe, we're not secure. We were brought back twice even, throughout this time. We were scattered again after Yeshua's death, and the Romans scattered them. And again, they were out, and then they came back in the 1940s. They still don't have peace. And I see them as reading these passages and thinking about God's promise to them that one day they will rejoice in the glory and the presence of Adonai. Right? That is ultimately still their hope. That's the book of Zechariah. That's the idea of a second coming of the Messiah, that they're all going to dwell in his presence, and that they're finally going to be the secure ones, that everybody else around them is going to be, put off, and they're not going to be able to hurt them anymore. And that's the hope they have. And I think what's really cool is, as Gentiles, or me, myself being a Gentile, I have the same hope that I could dwell in that same place with them, with God's people, that I am also God's people, and that my faith is credited to me as righteousness, and that God will, save them how he see fit. If he's Zechariah chapter, the end of Zechariah is crazy. It's so great. But they will see the pierced one, they will mourn, they will repent, and he will save his people. And then we all get to kind of spend those days together in his glory. So I hope this all, connected and made sense for everyone who read. Again, I know I didn't cover everything. There just really is so much. If I want to keep it around an hour, I can't, talk about a single aspect of every chapter. If there are any questions, just questions, comments, or whatever, for purposes of growth and study and what's it called, edification for each other and building each other up, please don't hesitate to ask. You can comment, you can DM me on Instagram. I do have Facebook Messenger and all that stuff. I don't check that as often as I do Instagram, so that's probably the best place to get it. My Instagram handle is Reggie J Thiel. You could get the links to all my social media by going to my website at thielthoughts.com. Of course, we're here on YouTube, and so you can check us out here. And I'll try to make sure to turn on comments. I think comments have been turned off of the video, so I'll turn that on so that we can comment there as well and have this discussion regarding the scriptures of God. I hope everyone has a great end to the week, and I'm really looking forward to reading and studying the next portion, which will cover that negotiation that Abraham has with God about a righteous city and Sodom and Gomorrah, as he's thinking about Lot, who lives there, and the destruction of that place, and just everything that happens after that. All right. Well, God bless you, and again, may you have a good week, and thanks again for watching. Bye.